It was just after 9 p.m. when the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court pulled out of the underground parking garage beneath the court building. The day had been long, a series of complex hearings followed by hours of writing opinions in his chambers. Streetlights flickered on as he drove through the quiet Washington streets, his mind still occupied with the constitutional questions that had dominated the day's arguments. The Chief Justice was a man who had spent decades interpreting the nation's laws. At 63, with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried himself with the measured dignity his position demanded. Yet tonight, in his plain blue sedan, he was simply a tired man heading home to his wife and the dinner she'd promised to keep warm. He turned onto a tree-lined avenue, the grand historic homes of Georgetown coming into view. The spring evening was pleasant enough that he'd rolled down his window slightly, letting in the scent of newly bloomed cherry blossoms that made Washington famous this time of year. The flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror came as a surprise. The Chief Justice checked his speedometer. He'd been going exactly the speed limit and signaled to pull over, guiding his car smoothly to the curb. As a man who had always respected law enforcement, his first thought was simple concern. Perhaps a taillight was out, or he'd failed to notice some minor traffic violation. He reached for his wallet, retrieving his driver's license as he waited for the officer to approach. This was routine, he thought. Nothing to worry about. The heavy footsteps approaching his car were quicker than expected, more urgent. The beam of a flashlight swept across his face with unnecessary brightness, causing him to squint and raise a hand to shield his eyes. Hands, where I can see them. The voice from beyond the light was sharp, tense, lacking the professional calm the Chief Justice had expected. "Of course, officer," he replied, slowly placing both hands on the steering wheel, his wallet and license still in his right hand. "I have my identification right here. I said hands on the wheel, both of them." The officer's voice rose, edged with something that made the Chief Justice's heartbeat quicken. Something was wrong. "My apologies," he said, setting his wallet on the dashboard with deliberate slowness. "It's just my license. Can we step out of the vehicle?" "Now." The Chief Justice blinked in confusion. "Officer, may I ask why I was pulled over?" What happened next occurred with a speed that left witnesses on nearby porches gasping. The officer yanked open the car door, grabbed the Chief Justice by his suit jacket, and roughly pulled him from the vehicle. "You people always think you're above the rules," the officer muttered, just loud enough for the Chief Justice to hear. The words carried a venom that shocked the older man nearly as much as the physical treatment. "Officer, there seems to be a misunderstanding," the Chief Justice began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Shut up," the officer snapped, spinning him around and pushing him against the car. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Expensive car, driving through this neighborhood where you don't belong." The Chief Justice felt his chest tighten. The expensive car was a 6-year-old sedan. The neighborhood where he didn't belong was 3 blocks from the home where he'd lived for 15 years. "Officer, my name is—" he began again, trying to explain, to bring reason to a situation rapidly spiraling out of control. The click of a gun being drawn silenced him. Around them, the evening seemed to freeze. A woman walking her dog across the street stopped mid-stride. A young couple on their porch stood up in alarm. A passing car slowed, then pulled over. "I said shut up," the officer hissed, and now the gun was pointed directly at the Chief Justice's head. "I'm tired of you people thinking you run everything. One more word and I'll—" The officer's next words were drowned out by the sound of doors opening. 2 people from the house directly opposite had emerged onto their front lawn. One held up a phone, clearly recording. "Hey," a voice called out. "What's going on over there? Why is your gun drawn?" The officer's attention flickered toward the voice, and in that moment the Chief Justice spoke with the calm authority that had defined his career on the bench. "Officer, I am the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. My ID is on the dashboard. I believe there has been a serious misunderstanding." Something in his tone, the unmistakable ring of truth, made the officer hesitate. But the gun remained pointed at the Chief Justice's head. "Yeah, right," the officer scoffed, but there was now uncertainty in his voice. And I'm the president. Check my identification, the Chief Justice insisted. Please. A second police car pulled up, its lights flashing but sirens silent. An older officer stepped out, a sergeant based on the stripes on his uniform. What's the situation here, Thompson? The sergeant called out. The first officer, Thompson, didn't lower his weapon. Got a suspect, fits the description from the robbery call. The sergeant approached cautiously, taking in the scene. The well-dressed older man with his hands up. The growing number of bystanders with phones recording. The expensive homes surrounding them. Sir, can you identify yourself? The sergeant asked, addressing the Chief Justice directly. My wallet is on the dashboard. You'll find my driver's license and Supreme Court identification there. The sergeant glanced at Thompson, whose face had gone pale. Lower your weapon, officer, he ordered quietly. But Sarge, now, Thompson. Reluctantly, Thompson lowered his gun, though he didn't holster it. The sergeant reached into the car and retrieved the wallet, opening it to reveal the identification. Cards inside, his expression changed immediately. Officer Thompson, holster your weapon immediately, the sergeant ordered, his voice now sharp with alarm. Then, turning to the Chief Justice, his tone transformed completely. Sir, I cannot begin to apologize for this misunderstanding. Are you hurt? I am physically unharmed, the Chief Justice replied with remarkable composure. He straightened his jacket, dignity intact despite the ordeal. Though I believe we have a serious situation to address. By now, at least a dozen onlookers had gathered. Phones recorded everything. Someone had recognized the Chief Justice and was explaining to others who he was. Whispers spread through the small crowd. Sir, if you would prefer to discuss this somewhere more private, the sergeant began. I think transparency is essential at this moment, the Chief Justice replied. Officer Thompson made several concerning statements that suggest this was not merely a case of mistaken identity. He referred to me as you people and suggested I didn't belong in this neighborhood. Thompson's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He was acting suspicious, he muttered. I was driving home from work, the Chief Justice corrected. Sergeant, I would like your badge number and Officer Thompson's. I will be filing a formal complaint, not out of vindictiveness, but because what happened here tonight represents precisely the kind of policing that undermines public trust in law enforcement. The sergeant nodded grimly. Of course, sir, and I'll be initiating an internal investigation immediately. A woman stepped forward from the gathering crowd. I got it all on video, she said. He had his gun pointed at your head for no reason. Others murmured agreement. Someone mentioned calling the news. Another suggested calling the Attorney General directly. The Chief Justice raised his hand, and the crowd quieted, a testament to his natural authority. What matters now is proper procedure. I appreciate everyone's concern, but let's ensure this is handled through the appropriate channels. Thompson stood rigidly by his patrol car, his expression a mixture of defiance and dawning horror as the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. The Chief Justice turned to him directly. Officer, I don't know what led you to approach me as you did tonight, but I want you to understand something. The law protects everyone equally, including you. You will have the opportunity to explain your actions through due process, the same due process that you nearly denied me tonight. The words hung in the air, simple but powerful. Several onlookers nodded in agreement. The sergeant was already on his radio, his voice low but urgent. Within minutes, more police cars arrived, along with an unmarked vehicle that brought a police captain to the scene. News vans weren't far behind, their satellite dishes visible from blocks away as they rushed toward what would soon become a national story. Through it all, the Chief Justice remained remarkably composed. He gave a brief statement to the captain, provided his contact information, and politely declined immediate medical attention. When asked if he wanted to press charges, he simply said, I want the law to take its proper course. As he was finally escorted to his car, now with a police captain apologizing profusely and offering a security detail to follow him home, the Chief Justice paused. He looked back at Officer Thompson, who was now sitting in the back of a police cruiser, being questioned by internal affairs officers who had arrived with remarkable speed. In that moment, their eyes met. The officer looked away first. The Chief Justice finally slid back into his car, closed the door, and took a deep breath. His first real moment of privacy since the ordeal began. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. Not from fear, but from the weight of what had just happened and what would surely follow. He knew that by morning this story would be everywhere. His private life, the quiet drive home he had taken countless times, would become a public symbol in the ongoing national conversation about race, power, and policing in America. As he started the engine, his phone rang. It was his wife, worried about why he was so late. He answered with remarkable steadiness in his voice. "I'm on my way home," he said. "But I'm afraid we have a difficult road ahead of us." In the rearview mirror, he could see the flashing lights, the gathering crowd, the news cameras already setting up. What had begun as a normal evening had transformed into something that would change not just his life, but possibly the course of the nation's ongoing struggle with its most fundamental promises of equality and justice. The road ahead, indeed. The Chief Justice arrived home just before midnight, pulling into his driveway with a police escort that he had repeatedly tried to decline. His modest two-story brick home, usually a sanctuary from the weightiness of his professional responsibilities, now seemed like the eye of a gathering storm. Lights were on throughout the house, unusual for this hour. His wife stood in the doorway, her face etched with concern. "I saw it on the news," she said as he approached. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. After 37 years of marriage, they rarely needed many words. "It happened so fast," he replied, his voice finally betraying the exhaustion and shock he'd been holding at bay. Inside their home, he sank into his favorite armchair, loosening his tie with fingers that still trembled slightly. "The president called," his wife said quietly, bringing him a glass of water. "Twice, and the attorney general. Your phone must be—" As if on cue, his cell phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, another news outlet requesting comment, and set it face down on the side table. "It's going to be a long night," he sighed, rubbing his eyes beneath his glasses. "And an even longer tomorrow." His wife sat across from him, her eyes never leaving his face. "Tell me what really happened." "Not what I saw on the news clips." He recounted the events slowly, methodically, as if delivering an oral argument before the court. His wife listened without interruption, though her expression shifted between disbelief, anger, and pain. "All these years," she finally said, "all your work, your position, and still—" He nodded, understanding everything contained in her unfinished thought. Despite his lifetime of achievement, despite rising to lead the highest court in the land, in the eyes of some, he was still just another black man who didn't belong. The doorbell rang. A sharp, unexpected sound in the quiet house. "That'll be the security detail the court administrator insisted on sending," he said, standing with effort. His body now felt every one of his 63 years. The adrenaline of the earlier confrontation giving way to bone-deep weariness. But when they opened the door, it wasn't court security. A small group of neighbors stood on their porch, some still in work clothes, others clearly pulled from their beds by the news. "We saw what happened," said an older woman who lived 2 doors down. "We wanted to make sure you were all right. And to let you know we're here," added another neighbor, a young law professor. "Whatever you need." The simple gesture, this small gathering of concerned faces in the middle of the night, affected the Chief Justice more deeply than all the official calls and messages. These were people who knew him not as the head of the judicial branch, but as the man who shoveled snow from his sidewalk and walked his dog each morning. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Truly, after they left, promising to help shield the family from the media circus that would surely descend by morning, the Chief Justice and his wife retreated to their kitchen. Sleep would be impossible now. "What will you do?" his wife asked, setting a cup of tea before him. "What I've always done," he replied after a moment of thought. "Follow the law where it leads." As dawn broke over Washington, the story exploded across the nation. Security camera footage from a nearby home had captured the entire incident in stark detail. The unwarranted aggression, the drawn weapon, the moment when recognition dawned on the officer's face. The video spread across social media with unprecedented speed. By 8 a.m., protesters had gathered outside police headquarters. By 9 a.m., the White House had issued a statement expressing grave concern. By 10 a.m., as the Chief Justice prepared to leave for the court under heavy security, Officer Thompson had been suspended without pay, and calls for his arrest echoed across cable news channels. The drive to the Supreme Court building, normally a peaceful 15 minutes, now required a full security detail. The Chief Justice stared out the window of the black SUV, watching his city transformed by what had happened to him. News vans lined the streets. Reporters stood ready with microphones. Signs were already being lifted by gatherers outside the court building. "We could enter through the garage," his security detail suggested. "No," the Chief Justice decided. "I'll use the front steps, as I do every day." As he emerged from the vehicle, a hush fell over the crowd, followed by a surge forward as reporters called his name. Camera flashes popped, microphones extended toward him like accusing fingers. The Chief Justice paused at the bottom of the marble steps, considering his words carefully. He had not planned to speak, but looking at the sea of faces, some angry, some concerned, all expectant, he realized that silence was not an option. "Last night," he began, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet plaza, "I experienced something that too many Americans have experienced before me. I was judged not by my character or my actions, but by assumptions based on my appearance." He paused, looking directly into the nearest camera. The law promises equal justice, equal protection, and equal dignity to all. When those promises are broken by anyone, our entire system is weakened. But when they are broken by those sworn to uphold the law, the damage goes deeper still. A reporter called out, "Will you be pressing charges against Officer Thompson?" The Chief Justice raised a hand. "I will not be trying this case in the media. I have faith in our system of justice, despite its imperfections. I expect a full investigation, followed by appropriate action based on facts, not emotions or politics." Another voice shouted, "Do you think this was racially motivated?" This question hung in the air. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. The Chief Justice considered his response carefully. "The officer's words and actions speak for themselves," he finally said. "The video footage is clear. I trust the American people to draw their own conclusions." With that, he turned and climbed the steps, his back straight, his pace unhurried. Inside the court building, his colleagues waited. The 8 associate justices had gathered in the conference room, an unprecedented morning meeting called in response to the crisis. As he entered, they rose as one, a gesture of respect but also solidarity. "This changes things," said the most senior associate justice, an older white man with whom the Chief Justice had often disagreed on legal matters. "Not just for you, but for all of us, for the court itself." The Chief Justice nodded, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Yes, but our duty remains unchanged." The morning's scheduled oral arguments had been postponed, a rare occurrence in the court's history. Instead, the justices spent 3 hours in intense discussion, not about the legal implications of what had happened, though those were significant, but about their human response to seeing their colleague, their friend, treated with such disregard for his basic humanity. Meanwhile, across town, the investigation was moving with unusual speed. The police chief had personally taken charge, reviewing not just the previous night's incident but Officer Thompson's entire record. What emerged was troubling. 3 prior civilian complaints of excessive force, all filed by minority citizens. All had been dismissed for insufficient evidence. His personnel file contained notes about communication issues and cultural sensitivity training recommended, but no substantive disciplinary actions. By midday, the mayor called a press conference, flanked by the police chief and the district attorney. What we witnessed in that video was not just a mistake or a misunderstanding, the mayor declared, her voice tense with controlled anger. It was a violation of everything our police department stands for. I have directed the district attorney to pursue criminal charges, and I have ordered a complete review of how previous complaints against this officer were handled. The police chief stepped forward. Effective immediately, Officer Thompson has been terminated from the Metropolitan Police Department. We are cooperating fully with the criminal investigation and the FBI civil rights inquiry that has been opened. Across the city, reactions were mixed. In some neighborhoods, residents expressed shock that such treatment could be directed at a Supreme Court justice. In others, particularly communities of color, the response was more resigned. If it could happen to him, what chance did ordinary citizens have? At the home of the officer, news cameras captured the scene as FBI agents arrived with a search warrant. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as boxes were carried out. Some expressed disbelief. They had known Thompson as a quiet neighbor who kept to himself. Others admitted there had been signs. Comments made at block parties, reactions to certain neighbors, a general sense of distance. Late in the afternoon, as the Chief Justice prepared to return home after a day unlike any in his long career, his clerk handed him a note. It was from Officer Thompson's mother, somehow delivered through the court's tight security. The note was simple. I raised my son better than what I saw on that video. I am ashamed and heartbroken. I pray you can forgive him even if justice must be served. The Chief Justice folded the note carefully and placed it in his pocket. It was a reminder of the human dimension beneath the headlines and hashtags, the families on all sides torn apart, when hatred found expression through power. As he left the court that evening, again through the front entrance despite security concerns, a different kind of crowd had gathered. Law students from nearby universities stood in silent rows on the steps, each holding a copy of the Constitution. It was a powerful image that would appear on front pages across the country the next morning, the solitary figure of the Chief Justice, walking between rows of young people holding up the document he had sworn to protect and interpret. No words were spoken. None were needed. In the car heading home, the Chief Justice stared out at his transformed city. News crews remained stationed outside police headquarters. Social media continued to explode with opinions, analysis, and calls to action. Politicians were already positioning themselves on all sides of the issue. But beneath the noise and fury, something important had happened. A truth long known by many but too often dismissed had been exposed in a way that could not be ignored or explained. The question now was what would be done about it, not just in terms of one officer's fate, but in addressing the deeper currents that had brought them all to this moment. The Chief Justice closed his eyes, suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of what lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, interviews with investigators, decisions about legal representation, questions about whether he should recuse himself from certain cases. But tonight, he would go home to his wife, to the neighbors who had stood on his porch in solidarity, to the small normal rituals that reminded him of his humanity beyond his title. That humanity, the right to be seen as an individual rather than a category, was what had been denied him on that street corner. And that humanity was what the law, at its best, existed to protect. 3 days after the incident, the city had settled into an uneasy rhythm. News vans remained parked outside the courthouse, the police headquarters, and at a respectful distance from the Chief Justice's home. Protesters gathered daily, their numbers growing rather than diminishing as the story spread. Social media buzzed with hashtags demanding justice, while political commentators debated the implications for law enforcement nationwide. In a small conference room at the Department of Justice, a team of investigators had been assembled. They sat around a large table covered with documents, laptops open to various databases and several monitors displaying the now infamous video from multiple angles. "Run it again," said the lead investigator, a veteran FBI agent with 27 years of experience in civil rights cases. Her team watched silently as the footage played, showing Officer Thompson approaching the Chief Justice's car with his hand already on his weapon. "That's not standard procedure for a traffic stop," noted a younger agent, pausing the video. His hand shouldn't be on his gun unless there's a perceived threat. And what threat could he possibly have perceived? Asked another agent. An older man in a sedan who had properly pulled over and had his hands visible? The lead investigator nodded. Let's dig deeper into Thompson's background. I want everything. Academy records, performance reviews, social media, personal associations. Something led to this behavior, and I doubt it started that night. Across town, similar work was underway at the Internal Affairs Division of the police department. Files had been pulled, colleagues interviewed, and body camera footage from Thompson's previous shifts reviewed with new scrutiny. I always thought he was a bit off, admitted a fellow officer who had partnered with Thompson during his first year on the force. He'd get tense around certain neighborhoods, certain types of people. I reported it to the sergeant back then, but nothing came of it. The sergeant in question, now nearing retirement, shifted uncomfortably in his chair during his own interview. Look, every rookie has adjustments to make. Thompson needed guidance, sure, but his arrest numbers were good. His paperwork was clean. In this job, you learn to work with what you've got. Even if what you've got is an officer with clear bias issues, pressed the Internal Affairs investigator. The sergeant had no good answer. Meanwhile, at his home, the Chief Justice had established a temporary office in his dining room. Court business continued despite the upheaval, with clerks bringing documents for his review and colleagues consulting by secure video conference. But today he had a different visitor. The district attorney, a sharp-minded woman in her 50s with a reputation for fairness, sat across from him, a thick folder open between them. We have enough to charge him with assault, civil rights violations, and making criminal threats, she explained. The evidence is overwhelming, especially with the video and audio. He's looking at serious prison time. The Chief Justice listened carefully, his fingers steepled in the thoughtful pose familiar to anyone who had ever observed him on the bench. And his defense? He asked, always mindful of seeing all sides. His attorney is floating the idea of diminished capacity due to PTSD from a shooting incident last year. They're also suggesting he mistook you for a suspect in a series of local robberies. The district attorney shook her head. It's weak, especially given what he said to you. Those weren't the words of someone making an honest mistake. The Chief Justice nodded. No, they weren't. Your testimony will be crucial, she continued. I know this puts you in an uncomfortable position given your role, but justice is not about comfort, he interrupted gently. I will testify to what happened, as would any citizen. After the district attorney left, the Chief Justice stood at his window, watching a light rain fall on his garden. His wife entered quietly, placing a cup of tea beside him. You're thinking about his mother's note, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he admitted. About cycles of hate, how they perpetuate. That young man wasn't born believing what he believes. Someone taught him, or something happened to him. Don't make excuses for him, his wife warned. Understanding is not excusing, he replied. To break a cycle, you must first see how it works. Their conversation was interrupted by a call from the lead FBI investigator. What she shared made the Chief Justice sit down heavily in his chair. The investigation had uncovered disturbing connections between Officer Thompson and an online group known for its white nationalist views. His digital footprint revealed years of engagement with racist content, carefully hidden from his professional life but extensive in his private one. More troubling still were the text messages recovered from his phone, exchanged with several friends who were also police officers in the same department. They're not just offensive, the FBI agent explained. They show a pattern of targeting black and brown drivers for pretextual stops. They would share locations, descriptions, even keep a kind of scoreboard. How many officers are implicated? The Chief Justice asked. At least 6 so far, including one supervisor who appears to have been aware of the practice. After the call ended, the Chief Justice sat in silence for a long time. What had begun as a single frightening encounter was expanding into something far more systemic, exactly what many community activists had been claiming for years. The next morning, news broke of the wider investigation. The police chief, looking haggard after sleepless nights, announced that all officers implicated had been placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation. "This goes against everything we stand for," he declared to a room full of skeptical reporters. "We will root out any officer who betrays the badge, no matter how difficult or painful that process may be." Online, Officer Thompson's history was being dissected by both journalists and amateur sleuths. High school classmates recalled troubling comments. A former girlfriend shared screenshots of disturbing messages. His digital life was laid bare, revealing a deep well of resentment and bigotry beneath the professional veneer. At a small diner across town, two older officers sat in a corner booth, coffee cooling before them as they spoke in low voices. "Could have been any of us making a bad call," said one, a 20-year veteran. "Split-second decisions, high stress. Now they're hanging Thompson out to dry." His companion, even longer on the force, shook his head. "This wasn't a split-second anything. You saw the video. He had his hand on his gun before he even got to the car. And those texts? No defending that. So what now? We all walk on eggshells? Second-guess every stop? Maybe we should," the older officer replied. "Maybe that's the point." Their conversation reflected debates happening throughout the department, throughout the city, throughout the country. Some officers feared a chilling effect on proactive policing. Others welcomed the scrutiny, having long been concerned about colleagues who tarnished their collective reputation. 1 week into the investigation, a whistleblower emerged from within the department, a records clerk who revealed that complaints, similar to those against Thompson, had been systematically downgraded or misclassified, effectively burying patterns of misconduct that might otherwise have been addressed earlier. "It wasn't a conspiracy," she explained to investigators. "It was culture. Problems with certain officers were seen as administrative headaches rather than warning signs. It was easier to file the papers away than to confront the issues." Her testimony led to the police commissioner announcing an independent audit of the department's complaint process, to be conducted by a civil rights organization with a history of both criticizing and collaborating with law enforcement. Meanwhile, the Chief Justice continued his daily work, refusing to be defined solely by what had happened to him. He heard oral arguments, wrote opinions, and maintained the dignified routine that had characterized his tenure on the court. But in private moments, he was increasingly drawn into reflection about his unique position at this moment in history. 2 weeks after the incident, he accepted an invitation to speak at a law school graduation. Though his speech had been written months earlier, he set it aside and spoke instead about the intersection of personal experience and constitutional principles. "The law is not abstract," he told the graduating students. "It lives in the space between power and vulnerability. It exists because without it the strong would dominate the weak, the majority would silence the minority, and fear would triumph over freedom." He did not directly mention his encounter with Officer Thompson, yet everyone understood the context. You are entering the profession of law at a time when its fundamental promise, equal justice under law, is being questioned by many Americans. Not because they reject that ideal, but because their lived experience tells them it remains unfulfilled. The speech was broadcast nationally, his words resonating beyond the law school auditorium to living rooms and classrooms across the country. As the third week of the investigation began, the evidence against Officer Thompson had grown overwhelming. His lawyer approached the district attorney about a possible plea deal, sensing that a trial would only further damage his client's already dim prospects. The Chief Justice was consulted about the potential agreement, which would include substantial prison time, mandatory rehabilitation, and a permanent ban from law enforcement. "Justice must be served," he told the district attorney. "But justice is not the same as vengeance. I would not object to terms that include the possibility of redemption, alongside accountability." His response surprised some observers who had expected him to push for the maximum possible sentence. But those who knew him best understood that his view of justice had always been more nuanced than punitive. The investigation continued to expand, reaching beyond Officer Thompson to examine structural issues within the department. Training procedures were scrutinized, Hiring practices were reviewed. Community oversight mechanisms were strengthened. What had begun as a terrifying moment for one man, even a man of considerable power and status, was evolving into a catalyst for changes long resisted by institutional inertia. At home one evening, exactly 3 weeks after the incident, the Chief Justice received an unexpected letter. Unlike the note from Thompson's mother, this one came from Thompson himself, written from the jail where he awaited the finalization of his plea agreement. The Chief Justice read it alone in his study, the single page covered in the uneven handwriting of a man clearly unaccustomed to expressing himself this way. "I don't expect forgiveness," Thompson had written. "I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that facing what I did, what I believed, has broken something in me that needed breaking. I see now how hate consumed me, how it distorted everything. The system is right to punish me. I only hope that someday I can find a way to make some kind of amends, not just to you, but to everyone my actions have hurt." The Chief Justice folded the letter carefully. He did not know if the words were sincere or simply calculated to influence his position on the plea deal. Perhaps it didn't matter. What mattered was that accountability was taking shape, not just for one officer, but for a system that had allowed bias to go unchecked for too long. The investigation would continue. The reforms would begin. The difficult conversations would unfold across dinner tables and precinct houses and legislative chambers. And through it all, the Constitution, the document those law students had held on the court steps, would provide both the framework for change and the reminder of what was possible when a nation confronted its failures honestly. The courthouse stood as a testament to an earlier era, its stone columns and broad steps designed to inspire confidence in the justice system. Today, those steps were lined with news crews, their satellite vans parked bumper to bumper along the street. Police barricades held back crowds of onlookers and protesters, their signs visible from blocks away. Inside, the corridors buzzed with whispered conversations as attorneys, court officers, and journalists moved purposefully between rooms. This was the first day of what many were already calling the most significant police misconduct trial in decades. In the end, Officer Thompson had rejected the plea deal, choosing instead to take his chances with a jury. His new defense attorney, a polished, expensive lawyer known for representing police officers accused of misconduct, had convinced him that the political climate would work in their favor. "They need a scapegoat," the attorney had told him during a jailhouse consultation. "But we can show that you were following your training, responding to a genuine threat as you perceived it. One mistake shouldn't end your career or send you to prison." Thompson, after weeks of seeming contrition, had latched onto this narrative. The letter he'd written to the Chief Justice was now dismissed as a moment of weakness, written under duress and emotional distress. In the courtroom, final preparations were underway. The judge, a veteran jurist with 30 years on the bench, reviewed her notes, occasionally glancing at the empty jury box that would soon hold 12 citizens tasked with determining Thompson's fate. The prosecutor arranged her materials meticulously. Video evidence, expert witness statements, Thompson's text messages, and testimony from his former colleagues. She had tried hundreds of cases in her career but felt the weight of this one differently. It wasn't just about one officer or one incident, it was about whether the system could hold itself accountable. At precisely 9 a.m., the side door opened, and Officer Thompson entered in civilian clothes, a navy blue suit that couldn't quite hide how the weeks in jail had thinned him. His family occupied the first row behind the defense table, their faces a mixture of defiance and fear. Minutes later, a door at the back of the courtroom opened, and the Chief Justice entered, accompanied by a single court security officer. Despite being the victim and key witness in the case, he carried himself with the same measured dignity he showed on the Supreme Court bench. He took his seat in the waiting area for witnesses, acknowledging the room with a slight nod but making eye contact with no one. The two men, one who had wielded power recklessly and one who had carried it responsibly, were now in the same room. For the first time since that night on a Georgetown street, the tension was palpable. The judge called the court to order and the jury filed in. They represented a cross-section of the city, different ages, races, occupations. Each had been carefully questioned during selection, probed for biases about law enforcement, racial issues, and preconceived notions about the high-profile case. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecutor stood before the jury, her voice clear and direct. "This case is about abuse of power in its most literal form," she began. "You will see video evidence of Officer Thompson approaching a law-abiding citizen with his weapon already drawn. You will hear audio of him using racially charged language. You will read text messages showing this was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern of targeting citizens based on their race." She walked them through what they would see and hear in the coming days, preparing them for evidence that would challenge their faith in those sworn to protect and serve. The defense attorney followed, his approach markedly different, warm, almost conversational. "Police officers make split-second decisions every day to keep us safe," he told the jury. "They face dangers we can't imagine, threats we never see coming." Officer Thompson responded based on his training and experience to what he perceived as suspicious behavior in an area where similar vehicles had been involved in crimes. He painted Thompson as a dedicated officer caught in a political firestorm, a convenient symbol for those with an agenda against law enforcement. "This case has been tried in the media, in the court of public opinion long before we gathered in this room," he concluded. "I'm asking you to set aside the headlines and hashtags and look at the facts as they really are." The first day proceeded with technical witnesses, the officers who arrived at the scene, the technicians who had analyzed the video footage, the dispatcher who had sent Thompson to the area on an unrelated call. Each testimony building a foundation for what was to come. On the second day, the prosecutor called a witness whose testimony stunned the courtroom. Thompson's former partner, a veteran officer who had requested a transfer after 6 months of working with him. "He had a system," the officer explained, visibly uncomfortable but determined. "He called it fishing. We'd drive through certain neighborhoods looking for what he called catches, mostly young black men, sometimes older ones in nice cars." "Did you report this behavior?" the prosecutor asked. "Once," the officer admitted. "To our sergeant. He told me Thompson got results and I should focus on learning from him instead of complaining." The defense tried to paint the former partner as disgruntled, suggesting personal conflicts rather than ethical concerns had prompted the transfer request. But the damage was done. The jury had heard first-hand testimony about Thompson's targeting practices. Other officers followed, some reluctantly confirming aspects of the department's culture, others defending Thompson as a proactive cop who was simply aggressive in fighting crime. The division within the force itself became evident as the trial progressed, reflecting broader debates about policing nationwide. On the third day, the prosecution played the complete video of the incident, enhanced by FBI technicians to capture every word, every movement. The courtroom fell silent as they watched the Chief Justice being pulled from his car, the gun pointed at his head, the slurs clearly audible. Thompson stared at the table throughout the video, unable or unwilling to watch his actions replayed before the packed courtroom. When the video ended, the prosecutor called her key witness, the Chief Justice himself. He took the stand with the measured pace that characterized his movements on the Supreme Court bench. After being sworn in, he sat with perfect posture, hands folded in his lap, his expression neutral yet attentive. The prosecutor began gently, establishing the events leading up to the traffic stop. The Chief Justice answered with precision, neither embellishing nor minimizing what had occurred. "When did you first realize the officer had drawn his weapon?" she asked. "When I felt the barrel against my temple," he replied, his voice steady despite the gravity of the words. "Until that moment, I believed we were having a miscommunication that could be resolved through calm conversation." "What went through your mind at that moment?" The Chief Justice paused, considering his answer carefully. "I thought of my wife," he said finally. "I thought of how she would learn what had happened to me. I thought of the cases on my desk that would go unfinished. And I thought of how many others had faced similar situations without the benefit of nearby security cameras or my position to protect them." His testimony continued for over an hour, delivered with the same thoughtful clarity he brought to his legal opinions. He never raised his voice or showed anger, Yet the impact of his words seemed to fill the courtroom. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to the law, now testifying about how that law had failed to protect him in a moment of vulnerability. When the defense attorney's turn came, his earlier confidence seemed diminished. He approached the witness stand with visible caution. "Your Honor," he began, using the Chief Justice's proper title. "Is it possible that in the darkness, Officer Thompson couldn't clearly see who you were?" "The street was well lit," the Chief Justice replied, "and his flashlight was directed at my face, but more importantly, he shouldn't have treated anyone the way he treated me, regardless of who they were." The defense attorney tried several angles, suggesting the Chief Justice might have made a sudden movement, might have said something provocative, might have misheard Thompson's words. Each attempt was met with calm, factual denial supported by the video evidence. By the time the Chief Justice stepped down from the witness stand, the defense's strategy appeared to be crumbling. Their own client's actions and words, captured clearly on video and corroborated by multiple witnesses, left little room for alternate interpretations. On the fourth day, the prosecution rested its case. The defense began by calling character witnesses: Thompson's police academy instructor, his church pastor, neighbors who described him as helpful and kind. Each tried to paint a picture of a dedicated officer whose actions that night were an aberration rather than a pattern. Then came the critical moment. Thompson himself took the stand. He had lost weight during his weeks in jail. His normally confident demeanor had given way to a tense, guarded posture. He avoided looking at the Chief Justice, who sat watching from the gallery. "Officer Thompson," his attorney began, "please tell the court about your state of mind that evening." Thompson cleared his throat. "I'd had a difficult shift. Earlier that day, we'd responded to a violent armed robbery where the suspect fled in a sedan similar to the one I stopped later. I was on high alert. And when you approached the vehicle, what did you perceive?" "I saw movement that concerned me," Thompson claimed. "In my experience, certain movements indicate a subject might be reaching for a weapon. My training kicked in, and I responded to protect myself and the public." The explanation contradicted the video evidence, which showed the Chief Justice sitting calmly with his hands visible. Several jurors frowned, taking notes. When the prosecutor's cross-examination began, her approach was methodical, almost gentle, allowing Thompson's own inconsistencies to undermine his credibility. "Officer Thompson, you testified that you approached the Chief Justice's vehicle because it matched a robbery suspect's car. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am. Yet dispatch recordings show no APB for a sedan matching that description that night. Can you explain that?" Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "It was similar enough to raise my suspicions. And the words you used during the stop, referring to you people and stating the driver didn't belong in that neighborhood, what did those refer to?" "I don't recall saying those things," Thompson replied, though the audio recording had captured the words clearly. "The text messages recovered from your phone, where you discussed targeting black drivers with several colleagues, were those also things you don't recall?" By the time the cross-examination ended, Thompson's testimony had done more harm than good to his case. He had appeared evasive, contradicting both the evidence and his earlier statements. In closing arguments, the defense attorney tried to reframe the narrative, emphasizing the pressures officers face and the split-second nature of their decisions. He urged the jury to consider Thompson's years of service rather than a single mistake. The prosecutor stood before the jury one last time. Her closing argument focused not on emotion, but on facts. "This case presents a simple question," she told them. "Are the protections of law truly equal for all citizens?" Officer Thompson's actions that night, his words, and the evidence of his past behavior all point to a troubling answer. Today, you have the opportunity to affirm that no one, not even a police officer, is above the law they swear to uphold. The jury received their instructions from the judge and filed out to begin deliberations. Legal experts predicted lengthy discussions given the high-profile nature of the case and the complex issues involved. Instead, the jury returned after just 4 hours. The courtroom hushed as they filed in, their faces solemn. The foreman handed the verdict to the court officer, who passed it to the judge. She reviewed it briefly, her expression giving nothing away, then returned it for the foreman to read. On the count of assault with a deadly weapon, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of civil rights violations, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of making criminal threats, we find the defendant guilty. Thompson showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read, staring straight ahead as if in shock. His family wept quietly in the gallery. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, already planning the appeal. The Chief Justice, seated in the back of the courtroom, closed his eyes briefly when the verdict was announced, not in triumph but in solemn acknowledgement of a painful but necessary process. Justice had been served, yet there was no joy in it, only the grim satisfaction that accountability had prevailed. As the courtroom began to empty, reporters rushed to file their stories and lawyers gathered their materials. The Chief Justice remained seated watching. This verdict was not an ending but a beginning. The real work of reform, the hard, unglamorous, essential work of changing systems and cultures, still lay ahead. 6 weeks after the verdict, the judge called the courtroom to order for Thompson's sentencing hearing. The room was packed once again, though the media presence had diminished somewhat as the initial shock of the case gave way to the slower, more complex story of its aftermath. Thompson sat at the defense table, visibly thinner than he had been at the start of the trial. Jail had not been kind to a former police officer. His family occupied the same front row seats they had throughout the proceedings, their expressions a mixture of resignation and lingering disbelief. The prosecution had recommended a 15-year sentence, citing the severity of the offense and the abuse of authority it represented. The defense had argued for leniency, emphasizing Thompson's prior service and lack of criminal history. Before announcing her decision, the judge asked if Thompson wished to speak. He stood slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded a piece of paper. "I've had a lot of time to think," he began, his voice rougher than it had been during his testimony. "When I first joined the force, I wanted to help people, to make a difference. Somewhere along the way I lost sight of that. I started seeing threats instead of people." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "What I did was wrong. The things I said, the way I acted, there's no excuse. I've hurt not just the Chief Justice, but my family, my community, and all the good officers who wear the badge, for the right reasons." He looked up from his paper. "I accept responsibility for my actions, and I am truly sorry." The judge listened impassively, then asked if the Chief Justice wished to make a victim impact statement. All eyes turned to the back of the courtroom, where he sat in a simple dark suit. The Chief Justice approached the podium with the measured pace that had become familiar to everyone who had followed the case. He carried no notes. "Your Honor," he began, "our justice system serves many purposes. It punishes wrongdoing, yes, but at its best, it also creates pathways to restoration and redemption." He turned slightly, addressing not just the judge but the courtroom as a whole. "I do not seek Mr. Thompson's destruction. What I seek, what I believe our community seeks, is accountability that leads to meaningful change. The appropriate sentence is one that acknowledges the severity of the offense while leaving room for the possibility of growth and atonement." His words surprised many who had expected him to advocate for the maximum sentence. Instead, he was suggesting a more nuanced approach, consistent with his long-held views on criminal justice reform. The judge considered both statements, then delivered her decision: 12 years, with the possibility of parole after 8, along with mandatory participation in racial bias rehabilitation programs. "Mr. Thompson," she concluded, "your actions represented the worst betrayal of the public trust. You targeted a citizen based on race, used excessive force without justification, and then attempted to justify your behavior with falsehoods. This sentence reflects the gravity of those actions." As Thompson was led away, the Chief Justice remained seated, his expression thoughtful. The legal process had reached its conclusion, but the broader implications were just beginning to unfold. Outside, the courthouse away from cameras and microphones, the Chief Justice was approached by Thompson's mother. She was a small woman, her face lined with grief but her posture straight with dignity. "Thank you," she said simply, "for speaking of redemption. I raised my son better than what he became, and I pray he finds his way back to the values he once had. The Chief Justice nodded. I believe in the possibility of change even from the darkest places. I wish your family healing through this difficult time. It was a brief human moment amid the legal machinery, a reminder that behind the headlines and politics were real people trying to make sense of what had happened and find a way forward. 3 months after the sentencing, the Chief Justice announced the formation of a special judicial commission on equal protection under the law, composed of judges, legal scholars, community activists, and law enforcement representatives. The commission would examine how the justice system could better fulfill its constitutional promises to all citizens. At the press conference, a reporter asked if his personal experience had influenced the initiative. We are all shaped by our experiences, the Chief Justice replied. What happened to me was not unique. It was simply more visible because of my position. This commission's work is about acknowledging that reality and addressing the systemic issues it reveals. The commission's first public hearing was held in a community center rather than a courthouse, a deliberate choice to make the proceedings more accessible. People lined up hours before the doors opened, eager to share their stories and perspectives. One by one, citizens approached the microphone. A grandmother who had watched her grandson being handcuffed for sitting in a park, a young professional who was routinely pulled over in his own neighborhood, a teenager who described how police responded differently when she called from her affluent school versus her working-class home. The Chief Justice listened to each testimony, occasionally asking questions, but mostly absorbing the lived experiences being shared. This wasn't about legal theories or constitutional abstractions. It was about how the law touched real lives in profoundly unequal ways. Law enforcement had their turn as well. Officers spoke of impossible expectations, insufficient training, and the challenges of making split-second decisions. A veteran police captain described the cultural changes he had tried to implement in his precinct, facing resistance at every turn. The problem isn't just a few bad officers, he explained. It's systems that protect them, cultures that enable them, and training that fails to address the biases we all carry. Meanwhile, across town, the police department was undergoing its own transformation. The investigation sparked by Thompson's case had led to the resignation of the police chief and several high-ranking officers. The new leadership, including the department's first black female chief, had instituted sweeping reforms. Every officer now underwent enhanced training on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. Complaint procedures had been overhauled, with independent civilian review, boards given real authority. Body cameras were mandatory, with footage regularly audited for signs of problematic behavior before incidents occurred. Most significantly, the department had changed its approach to officer evaluation. Instead of measuring success by number of arrests or citations, officers were now assessed on community engagement, problem-solving, and successful de-escalation of potentially volatile situations. These changes hadn't come easily. Some veteran officers had resigned in protest. Police union representatives had fought against what they saw as excessive oversight. Politicians had worried about being seen as anti-police if they supported the reforms. But the video of a Supreme Court Chief Justice staring down the barrel of a police officer's gun had made the status quo indefensible. Public opinion had shifted dramatically, creating political space for changes long advocated by community activists, but previously dismissed as radical. 6 months after the incident, a national police reform bill bearing the Chief Justice's name was introduced in Congress. The bill would create nationwide standards for police training, establish a database to track officer misconduct across jurisdictions, and provide funding for community-based alternatives to traditional policing. The debate was fierce. Supporters pointed to Thompson's case as evidence of systemic problems requiring federal intervention. Opponents argued that policing should remain locally controlled and that the case represented one officer's failings, not a national crisis. The Chief Justice, bound by judicial ethics, could not publicly advocate for the legislation, but his commission's preliminary findings, released as the congressional debate began, provided powerful evidence for the need for structural change. In a rare national address from his chambers, Broadcast on the one-year anniversary of the incident, the Chief Justice reflected on what had been learned. "A year ago today, I experienced something that countless Americans have experienced without the benefit of my position or the protection of cameras," he began. That moment could have remained a personal trauma. Instead, it became a catalyst for necessary change. He spoke of the Commission's work, the police department's reforms, and the ongoing national conversation about race and justice. He acknowledged the progress made while emphasizing how much remained to be done. "Equal justice under law is not merely the words engraved on the Supreme Court building," he said. "It is a promise we must fulfill anew each day through policies, practices, and a commitment to see the humanity in every person who comes before our courts or encounters law enforcement on our streets." The address was watched by millions, including Officer Thompson, who viewed it from the prison library. Prison officials reported that he had been a model inmate, working as a GED tutor and participating in every available rehabilitation program. Thompson had declined all interview requests, choosing instead to write a series of reflections on his journey from police officer to prisoner. These writings, shared with a restorative justice program, revealed a man grappling honestly with the biases that had shaped his actions and the harm he had caused. "I can't undo what I did," he wrote in one essay, "but I can dedicate whatever life I have left to understanding why I did it and helping others avoid the same dark path." 2 years after the incident, the police reform bill finally passed, though, in a compromised form that reflected the continuing tensions around the issue. The Chief Justice's Commission released its final report, a comprehensive blueprint for building a more equitable justice system. The report began with a simple premise, that the promise of equal protection could not be fulfilled without acknowledging the historical and ongoing inequities in how the law was applied. It ended with practical recommendations for courts, police departments, prosecutors, and communities across the country. At a small ceremony marking the report's release, the Chief Justice spoke not as the victim in a high-profile case, but as a jurist who had witnessed both the system's failures and its capacity for renewal. "The law, at its best, is not static but evolving, learning from its mistakes and striving always toward a more perfect justice," he said. What happened on that? Street corner was a failure of our system. What has happened since is a testament to our collective commitment to do better. As he returned to his chambers afterward, he passed the words engraved above the Supreme Court entrance, "Equal justice under law." Those words had always guided his work as a jurist. Now they carried a deeper, more personal meaning, not just as a constitutional ideal, but as a lived experience with all its complexity and challenge. The incident that began with a gun pointed at his head had become something larger than himself. It had opened a door that could not be closed again, initiating changes that would continue long after the headlines faded and the public attention moved elsewhere. Real change, the Chief Justice knew, wasn't found in dramatic courtroom moments or headline-grabbing legislation. It happened in the quiet, persistent work of reforming systems, changing cultures, and expanding our collective capacity to see each other's humanity. That work would continue, day by day, case by case, community by community, the slow, essential labor of making equal justice not just an inscription on a building but a reality in American life.